when we talk about Torah observance, like we've been doing in the Matthew study, what Yeshua brought to the equation is the importance of living according to the Spirit, which means you can still retain your Torah observant lifestyle as long as you do it living according to the Spirit. Don't walk according to the letter of the law, but walk according to the Spirit of the law. And in doing so, you will fulfill the righteous requirement of law. Paul actually said that earlier, if you were to take your Bible and go back up a few verses in the same chapter that we're in. You can lead a Torah observant lifestyle that's pleasing to God, and you can do it while living according to the Spirit. Because why? The Spirit of God is not in competition with the law of God. On the contrary, the Spirit of God is going to be in full agreement with the words of God, because we're talking about one God and one Spirit, like Paul says in other parts of his letters. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, right? One Spirit that's driving the show. So the same Spirit that inspired the writing of the Torah is the same Spirit that lives inside of you, that empowers you to do this, to do what? You ready for it? To be Torah obedient. Yeah, radical thing that is. Okay, so live according to the Spirit, and if you do so, you're going to set your mind on the things of the Spirit. Here's the contrast again. If you set your mind on the flesh, it's death. By comparison, Paul says, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. Indeed, if we were to take verse 6 of chapter 8 here in Romans and use it as a commentary to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, where Paul talks about this Torah as a ministry of death, right? The thing that was thought to be life was bringing death to me, like he said in the previous chapter here in Romans, chapter 7. Why is the Torah a ministry of death? Is because if you set your mind on the flesh, if your heart is not circumcised, but merely your flesh, like your average Israelite was, or your average Jew today who doesn't believe in Jesus, then that default status is a mind set on the flesh, even though you're trying to keep Torah, and even though you might look religious to other people on the outside. On the inside, there's been no heart change, no circumcision of the heart. And so for that reason, as much as you try to keep Torah, on the one hand, there might be a kind of a semblance of Torah keeping, because parts of the Torah can be kept kind of in automatic mode. You don't have to really think about it. You can just do them. But on the other hand, the Torah isn't really going to be fulfilled according to the Spirit, because you don't have the ability to do it. You've not been changed from the inside out. You've not been born again. And so your mind is going to be set on the flesh, and the Torah is actually going to be a ministry of death to you. Ultimately, it's going to seek to kill you over and over again. You don't even realize that, but that's exactly what it's going to be doing. And so it's death if you set your mind that way. But by contrast, to set your mind on the Spirit is life and peace. So you can lead a Torah observant life. You can affirm all the things that God asks you to affirm if you're a religious Jew. But if you're doing it according to the power of the Spirit, it's going to be radically different. It might look similar to other people on the outside. You might still look like a religious Jew. But from God's perspective, you're going to have a power in your life. You're going to have a true witness and a light and a life and a vibrancy that can only come by having the Son of God taking up residency on the inside of a man. Let's keep reading. Paul says, for the mind that's set on the flesh is hostile to God, for it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. So there's a sense in which the righteous fulfillment of the law can't be accomplished until you become a believer, right? That's a very stark reality in Paul's mind. You can't really do what God asks you to do the way that God designed it to be done until you confess Jesus as Lord. However, Paul already knows, and I have this conversation with people all the time, it is possible to do what the Torah asks you to do, even as an unbeliever, but you just have to realize that there's an element of Torah keeping that's very earthly or fleshly or temporal. It simply functions in the way of getting the job done on a pragmatic level, right? There are parts of the Torah that describe actions that you should do to your neighbor, things you should do to your spouse, or things you should do for the general community around you. Like, for instance, if we could include the commandment to be fruitful and multiply in the book of Genesis, or the commandment to circumcise your babies on the 8th day in Leviticus, and things like that. You don't have to be filled with the Spirit of God to be able to be fruitful and multiply. Last time I checked, there are billions of people around the world who are able to keep that commandment without any recognition of God, right? You don't have to be able to love God to be able to be fruitful and multiply, right? Doesn't require Jesus to know how to have procreation, right? To procreate. Likewise, you don't have to be Spirit-filled to be able to circumcise your baby on the 8th day. So what's the point I'm trying to make? Is there are parts of the Torah that you can just walk into because they are very pragmatic. They're practical. They're meant to be able to be done by any generic, average Israelite or person who's Torah observant, right? And they kind of help to keep the world functioning and help keep the world going around, right? Imagine how the world would stop if everyone stopped procreating, right? Be a big problem. So that's not what Paul's talking about. He's aware that you can keep parts of the Torah without confessing Jesus as Lord. Indeed, if from a child perspective, as you're brought into a family of Torah-keeping parents, then you are probably going to be keeping the Torah as a child. Obey your parents. That's part of the 10 Commandments, right? Children, obey your parents. You can keep that commandment as a child even before you know who Jesus is.